The year was 1857, and inside the red sandstone walls of Delhi's imperial palace, an 81-year-old poet sat on a throne that commanded nothing but memories. His name was Abu Zafar Sirajuddin Muhammad Bahadur Shah II, though history and literature would remember him simply by his poetic pen name, Bahadur Shah Zafar. He carried the grand and ancient title of Mughal Emperor, a designation that had once signified absolute dominion over the vast and wealthy expanse of the Indian subcontinent. Yet, in the twilight of his life, Zafar's reality was sharply at odds with the magnificent titles he bore. He could not raise a formidable army, he could not negotiate treaties with foreign powers, and he could not collect the vast agrarian revenues that had once funded the glittering architecture of his ancestors. His empire had been systematically reduced to a ceremonial court, an intricate bubble of prestige entirely surrounded and managed by the overwhelming military and administrative might of the British East India Company. Zafar was, for all practical purposes, a pensioner of a foreign corporation, heavily reliant on the British for his financial allowance and political survival. But on the morning of May 11, the quiet, melancholic routine of the Mughal court was violently shattered. Below the palace windows, rebel soldiers from the garrison town of Meerut arrived in Delhi, their uniforms covered in the dust of a frantic overnight march. They had mutinied against their British officers, turning their weapons against the East India Company, and they had come to the Red Fort with a monumental demand. They insisted that the elderly poet become the symbolic leader of a massive armed uprising against the British Empire. The tension of that moment was defined by a profound historical contradiction. Zafar possessed almost no practical power, yet his name, his bloodline, and his ceremonial legitimacy remained potent enough to threaten the foundations of British rule in India. The rebel soldiers knew that they could not unite a fractured subcontinent under the banner of a nameless military mutiny, but they believed they could fight a war of liberation in the name of the Mughal emperor. Forced to make an impossible choice, the reluctant emperor was suddenly thrust into the center of the greatest anti-colonial uprising of the 19th century. What followed was a tragedy of immense proportions, ending in the destruction of his city, the collapse of his dynasty, and his own harrowing descent into captivity. To understand what happened to India's last Mughal emperor when the rebellion failed and the empire finally disappeared, one must first look back at the long, slow, and devastating unraveling of the Mughal world, and the relentless rise of the corporate empire that replaced it. The political power of the Mughal Empire did not disappear in a single catastrophic moment, nor was it destroyed by one battle, one ruler, or one religious policy. The decline that trapped Bahadur Shah Zafar in his powerless state in 1857 was the result of a complex fragmentation that had taken place over many generations. At its height, under emperors like Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, and Aurangzeb, the Mughal Empire was an administrative and military behemoth governing a massive population and controlling a staggering share of global wealth. The empire was held together by an intricate system of revenue collection, elite military nobility, and a centralized bureaucracy that successfully managed the diverse regional, linguistic, and religious identities of the subcontinent. However, the seeds of the empire's vulnerability were sown well before Zafar was even born. Following the death of Emperor Aurangzeb in 1707, the imperial center in Delhi began to lose its grip on the distant provinces. The empire faced severe administrative strain, overextended military lines, and the immense financial cost of prolonged wars. Without a clear and universally accepted law of succession, the death of an emperor routinely triggered devastating wars among his sons, fracturing the nobility and draining the imperial treasury. As the imperial center weakened, provincial governors, the Nawabs and Nizams, began to assert their independence. While they often continued to invoke the Mughal emperor's name on their coinage and in their Friday prayers, recognizing his theoretical sovereignty, they effectively ruled their territories as independent kings, keeping the vital tax revenues for themselves. The empire also faced intense military pressure from regional powers. The Maratha Confederacy expanded dramatically from the Deccan Plateau, establishing a massive footprint across central and northern India, and fundamentally challenging Mughal supremacy. In the Punjab, the Sikhs organized into powerful misls, further stripping away the emperor's traditional territories. But the most traumatic blow to the prestige and wealth of the empire came from beyond the subcontinent. In 1739, the Persian ruler Nader Shah invaded northern India, crushed the Mughal army at the Battle of Karnal, and marched into Delhi. The subsequent sack of the city was apocalyptic. Nader Shah's forces massacred tens of thousands of citizens, looted the imperial treasury, and carried away the legendary peacock throne, leaving the Mughal emperor as a traumatized figurehead ruling over a broken city. By the time Bahadur Shah Zafar was born in Delhi in 1775, the Mughal emperor was little more than a pawn in the high-stakes political struggles between the Marathas, the Afghans, and the ascendant European colonial powers. Into this fractured geopolitical landscape stepped a foreign entity unlike any traditional conqueror. the British East India Company. Chartered by Queen Elizabeth I in 1600, the company was originally established as a joint stock trading corporation designed to secure a share of the lucrative Indian Ocean spice and textile trade. For over a century, the company operated out of coastal trading posts, deeply reliant on the permission and protection of the Mughal authorities. However, as the Mughal state weakened and regional kingdoms warred for supremacy, the East India Company increasingly militarized its operations to protect its commercial interests. Through a combination of superior naval technology, the aggressive use of mercenary armies, and the relentless exploitation of local political divisions, the company began to transform from a commercial enterprise into a territorial power. The turning point occurred at the Battle of Plassey in 1757, where the company defeated the Nawab of Bengal, effectively seizing control of one of the richest provinces in the world. This was followed by a decisive victory at the Battle of Busar in 1764, which led the defeated Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II to sign the Treaty of Allahabad in 1765. Under this treaty, the emperor formally granted the East India Company, the Diwani, the right to collect taxes and manage the revenues of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. This created a profound historical paradox that would define British rule in India for the next century. The company, a profit-driven corporation headquartered in an office building in London, had become the official tax collector for the Mughal Empire, using Indian revenues to finance its own expansion. The Mughal emperor retained his ceremonial status, but the company increasingly controlled the practical machinery of administration and military force. By 1803, British forces under Lord Lake captured Delhi itself from the Marathas. The British entered the city not explicitly as conquerors of the Mughal throne, but officially as the protectors of the emperor. The emperor was granted a pension, and his absolute authority was restricted to the inner walls of the Red Fort. The vast subcontinent was now largely dominated by a foreign corporation, and the Mughal dynasty was preserved essentially as a museum piece, useful to the British for maintaining a facade of traditional legitimacy. It was in this twilight era of faded glory and corporate domination that Bahadur Shah Zafar ascended the throne in 1837. He was already 62 years old, an elderly man, taking command of an empire that existed only in name. The court succession politics that brought him to power were heavily influenced by the British resident in Delhi, the official who managed the East India Company's relationship with the royal household. Zafar's accession was an exercise in solemn irony. Contemporary conditions made clear that his throne carried far more ceremony than practical power. He could not venture far beyond the Red Fort without British permission, and his household was entirely dependent on the political pension issued by the company. Yet, to view Zafar merely as a defeated monarch is to deeply misunderstand his true historical identity. If he was denied the power of a king, he embraced the life of a mystic and an artist. Zafar was a deeply spiritual man, profoundly influenced by Sufi traditions. He viewed the world with a philosophical detachment born of political powerlessness, and he channeled his energies into the one domain where the British could not dictate terms, the cultural life of Delhi. The Red Fort, stripped of its military significance, blossomed into one of the greatest literary and cultural centers of the 19th century. Under Zafar's patronage, the court became a sanctuary for the finest minds of the age. It was a world of musical gatherings, intricate calligraphy, elevated philosophical debates, and above all the transcendent art of Urdu poetry. The late Mughal court hosted legendary literary salons, known as musharas, where the rhythmic beauty of the Urdu language reached its absolute zenith. Zafar himself was an accomplished and respected poet, using his pen name to express the sorrows of his life, the fleeting nature of worldly power, and his devotion to divine love. He was surrounded by literary giants figures like Sheikh Ibrahim Zauk, who served as his poetic mentor, the brilliant and complex Mirza Ghalib, and the romantic master Momin Khan Momin. The poetry of this era was intensely emotional, often reflecting a deep sense of loss, a longing for a vanished past, and a sophisticated resignation to fate. The cultural prestige of Delhi remained unmatched, even as its political walls crumbled. To the people of northern India, the emperor may have been poor and powerless, but he remained the custodian of their civilization, the living link to a glorious past, and the ultimate symbol of a refined and magnificent culture. But outside the poetry-filled courtyards of the Red Fort, a profound and dangerous crisis was escalating across the subcontinent. The decades leading up to 1857 were defined by the aggressive and highly disruptive policies of the East India Company. Under the leadership of governors general like Lord Dalhousie, the company pursued a relentless campaign of territorial expansion and political centralization. One of the most resented tools of this expansion was the doctrine of lapse, a policy dictating that if an Indian ruler died without a natural-born male heir, the British would not recognize an adopted successor, and the kingdom would simply be annexed by the company. This policy was used to swallow up historic states like Jhansi, Satara, and Nagpur, dispossessing ruling families and spreading immense anxiety among the Indian aristocracy. The most devastating political shock occurred in 1856, when the British annexed the prosperous state of Awadh, claiming that its ruler was incompetent. Awadh had been one of the company's most loyal allies, and its aggressive annexation shattered whatever remaining trust the Indian nobility had in British treaties. The dispossession of the Nawab of Awadh threw thousands of courtiers, artisans, and soldiers into poverty, generating deep-seated anger across northern India. This political dispossession was matched by severe economic disruption. The East India Company's revenue policies were often harsh and inflexible, heavily taxing the peasantry and disrupting traditional systems of land ownership. Ancient aristocratic families were stripped of their ancestral lands when they could not produce written title deeds to satisfy British colonial courts. Furthermore, the influx of cheap, mass-produced British textiles devastated traditional Indian artisanal industries, plunging weaving communities into economic ruin. Alongside these economic and political grievances, a profound cultural and religious anxiety began to grip the population. The increased presence of Christian missionaries, who often openly mocked Hindu and Muslim beliefs, combined with new British laws regarding inheritance and widow remarriage, convinced many Indians that the company intended to systematically destroy their religions and forcibly convert the subcontinent to Christianity. The most dangerous manifestation of these mounting grievances occurred within the ranks of the Bengal Army, the massive military force employed by the East India Company to secure its northern and eastern territories. The sepoys, the Indian infantrymen who formed the backbone of the company's power, were predominantly high-caste Hindus and land-owning Muslims from Awadh and Bihar. Despite their vital role in building the British Empire in India, the sepoys faced systemic discrimination. They were barred from rising to the officer ranks, they received lower pay than their British counterparts, and they were increasingly stripped of their traditional privileges. The deep reservoir of resentment within the army was ignited by an immediate and highly explosive trigger, the introduction of the new Enfield rifle. To load the Enfield rifle, soldiers were required to bite open the end of a greased paper cartridge to pour the gunpowder down the barrel. In early 1857, a rumor swept through the army encampments that the grease used to waterproof these cartridges was made from a mixture of cow fat and pig fat. For the Hindu soldiers, the cow was deeply sacred, and consuming its fat was an act of profound defilement that would destroy their caste status. For the Muslim soldiers, the pig was strictly forbidden by religious law, and contact with its fat was a horrifying spiritual pollution. The British military command, dangerously disconnected from the cultural realities of their own troops, initially dismissed the rumors and offered bureaucratic assurances that failed to restore trust. For the sepoys, the cartridges were not merely a matter of military supply. They were the ultimate proof of the terrifying rumor that the company intended to strip them of their faith and their identity. The historical reality of the precise composition of every batch of grease matters less than the absolute conviction among the soldiers that their spiritual lives were under deliberate attack. The breaking point arrived in May, 1,857 inches, the cantonment town of Meerut, located just a short distance from Delhi. When a group of cavalry sepoys refused to touch the suspected cartridges, they were subjected to a swift and brutal court-martial. The British command stripped the men of their uniforms, shackled them in heavy iron fetters in front of the entire garrison, and marched them off to prison. This public humiliation proved to be a fatal miscalculation. On Sunday, May 10, the remaining Indian soldiers in Meerut erupted into open rebellion. They broke open the jail to free their comrades, set fire to the British bungalows, and killed several British officers and civilians in the ensuing chaos. Having crossed the Rubicon of mutiny, the rebels knew they could not stay in Meerut and wait for British reinforcements. They needed a strategic center, and more importantly, they needed a political banner under which they could rally the fractured forces of the subcontinent. There was only one destination that made historical and symbolic sense. Under the cover of darkness, the rebel cavalry rode hard through the night, heading toward the ancient imperial capital of Delhi. When the dust-covered mutineers crossed the Yamuna River and appeared beneath the walls of the Red Fort on the morning of May 11, the elderly Bahadur Shah Zafar was entirely unprepared for the violent collision of history taking place at his doorstep. The rebels entered the city and approached the palace, demanding an audience with the emperor. Their message was clear. The British rule was over, and the Mughal emperor must assume the leadership of a grand war of independence. Zafar's initial response, according to contemporary evidence, was one of profound shock and deep hesitation. He did not possess a secret revolutionary army, he had no treasury to pay these soldiers, and he was acutely aware of the devastating military power that the British could bring down upon his city. He was an old man who wanted to spend his final years writing poetry in peace, not commanding a violent and unpredictable rebellion, but the situation was entirely beyond his control. The rebel troops flooded the palace courtyards, disregarding court etiquette and treating the terrified emperor as a captive to their demands. British officials and civilians within the city and the palace were hunted down and killed, making any possibility of Zafar reconciling with the East India Company completely impossible. Surrounded by armed men, cut off from his British handlers, and realizing that his name was the only mechanism that might bring some semblance of order to the escalating chaos, Zafar reluctantly bowed to the pressure. He accepted the nominal leadership of the rebellion, giving his blessing to the soldiers and allowing proclamations to be issued in his imperial name, declaring a holy war against the foreign rulers. Delhi was instantly transformed into the fiery heart of the uprising. For the first time in half a century, the Mughal capital was entirely free of British control. Yet, the reality of governing the rebellious city proved to be a desperate and chaotic struggle. A provisional administration was established, and some of Zafar's sons, the Mughal princes, were appointed to high military commands. However, these princes had lived their entire lives in the sheltered luxury of the Red Fort. They had no practical military experience and commanded little respect from the battle-hardened sepoy veterans. Zafar found himself trapped in a maddening position. He was hailed as the Emperor of Hindustan, but he struggled to maintain basic law and order in his own capital. Proclamations were issued bearing his seal, appealing for absolute unity between Hindus and Muslims in the face of the British threat. The emperor explicitly banned the slaughter of cows during the Islamic festival of Eid to honor the religious sentiments of his Hindu soldiers, demonstrating a desperate desire to hold the fragile coalition together. But the logistics of the rebellion were failing. The rebel administration lacked a unified command structure, and communication with other major centers of the uprising, such as Kanpur and Lucknow, was sporadic at best. Inside Delhi, supply shortages became catastrophic. The unpaid sepoys began to loot the city's wealthy merchants, causing immense suffering among the civilian population. Zafar repeatedly threatened to abdicate, retreating to a local shrine in despair at the violence and indiscipline ravaging the city, but he was always persuaded to return by soldiers who needed his symbolic aura to legitimize their fight. He was an emperor who could not command, a leader who could only watch, as his capital slowly devoured itself. While the rebel forces struggled to organize their newly won freedom, the British Empire was rapidly mobilizing a terrifying response. The loss of Delhi was an unacceptable blow to British prestige, and the East India Company marshaled all its available resources to crush the uprising. British forces, heavily reinforced by loyalist troops from the Punjab and Gurkha regiments from Nepal, marched on Delhi and seized the elevated rocky ridge overlooking the city. Thus began the grueling summer siege of 1857. For months the two sides engaged in brutal skirmishes and heavy artillery duels. The heat was suffocating, and cholera swept through both camps. Inside the walls, the rebels fought with immense courage, but they were hampered by a critical lack of gunpowder, coordinated leadership, and reliable provisions. The British, despite taking heavy casualties, steadily reinforced their positions, driven by a fierce desire for vengeance and the strategic necessity of reclaiming the Mughal capital. The climax of the siege arrived in mid-September. British artillery systematically pounded the northern walls of Delhi, creating massive breaches in the ancient defenses. On September 14, British and Loyalist infantry launched a desperate and bloody assault, blowing open the Kashmiri Gate and fighting their way into the city. The street fighting that followed was savage and unsparing. Rebel soldiers fired from rooftops and barricades, contesting every alleyway and mosque. But the discipline and firepower of the British forces slowly overwhelmed the defenders. As the British pushed deeper into the city, military discipline frequently collapsed into a frenzy of looting and retaliatory violence. The British capture of Delhi was not merely a military victory, it was an act of profound and terrifying vengeance. Suspected rebels and ordinary civilians alike were executed in the streets. Homes were plundered, ancient libraries were destroyed, and the surviving civilian population was driven out of the city gates to starve in the surrounding countryside. The cultural sanctuary that Zafar had spent his life cultivating was annihilated in a matter of days. Recognizing that the city had fallen, and the Red Fort could no longer be defended, Zafar was forced to flee the palace of his ancestors. Accompanied by his favored wife, Zinat Mahal, a few surviving princes, and a small retinue of loyal followers, the elderly emperor slipped out of the city and sought refuge a few miles to the south, at the sprawling garden tomb of his ancestor, the Emperor Humayun. The symbolism of this retreat was incredibly profound. Humayun's tomb, a magnificent masterpiece of 16th century architecture, housed the remains of the second great Mughal emperor, representing the dawn of the dynasty's power in India. Now, nearly 3 centuries later, it served as the final, desperate hiding place for the last reigning Mughal. But the respite was brief. The British military intelligence network, heavily reliant on local informants, quickly discovered the emperor's location. The task of capturing the Mughal emperor was given to Captain William Hodson, a notoriously ruthless and fiercely ambitious intelligence officer of the British Army. Hodson rode out to the tomb with a contingent of cavalry, effectively surrounding the vast complex. He sent emissaries inside to negotiate the emperor's surrender. Zafar, exhausted, broken, and realizing the absolute futility of further resistance, agreed to give himself up. However, Historical accounts strongly suggest that the surrender was secured only after Hodson offered a guarantee that the emperor's life and the lives of his immediate companions would be spared. The elderly monarch emerged from the shadows of the ancient mausoleum and was placed into a palanquin. Surrounded by armed British cavalry, Bahadur Shah Zafar was carried slowly back to the city of Delhi, no longer a sovereign, but a prisoner of war. If the capture of the emperor was conducted with a tense negotiated formality, the events of the following day shattered any illusion of British clemency. William Hodson returned to Humayun's tomb, this time demanding the unconditional surrender of several key Mughal princes who had taken refuge there, including Zafar's sons Mirza Mughal and Khizr Sultan, and his grandson Abu Bakr. These princes had been deeply involved in the rebel administration of Delhi, and the British held them directly responsible for the mutiny and the earlier killings of European civilians. Hodson forced the princes into a bullock cart and began the journey back to the city, surrounded by a large and increasingly hostile crowd of Indian onlookers. Fearing that the crowd might attempt to rescue the royal prisoners before they reached the safety of the British garrison, Hodson made a brutal and unilateral decision. He stopped the cart near one of the city's ancient gateways. He ordered the princes to step down and forced them to strip off their upper garments, a deliberate act of profound humiliation. Then, seizing a carbine from one of his soldiers, Hodson personally shot all 3 unarmed princes at point-blank range. Their bodies were thrown into a cart and taken into the city, where they were publicly displayed in front of the Kotwali, the central police station, as a terrifying warning to anyone who still harbored thoughts of resistance. The location where the executions took place would forever be known as Khuni Darwaza, the Gate of Blood. The killings were a calculated political act designed to permanently sever the dynastic bloodline and ensure that the Mughal family could never again serve as a rallying point for a free India. While later legends suggest that the severed heads of the princes were presented to Zafar on a silver platter, historians treat this specific gruesome detail with caution, as contemporary records do not universally confirm it. What is unquestionable, however, is the devastating reality that Zafar's heirs were dead, and his dynasty had been violently extinguished. With the rebellion in Delhi crushed and the royal family decimated, the British East India Company faced the unprecedented legal and political challenge of what to do with the captive emperor. They decided to put him on trial. On the 27th of January 1858, the military trial of Bahadur Shah Zafar began. The setting chosen for this unprecedented event was a masterpiece of cruel irony. The British convened the military commission inside the Diwan-e-Khas, the exquisite hall of private audiences within the Red Fort. This was the very room where Mughal emperors had once sat upon the peacock throne to receive ambassadors and dictate the fate of millions, a room whose walls bore the famous Persian inscription, "If there is a paradise on earth, it is this, it is this, it is this." Now, it was stripped of its grandeur, serving as a makeshift British military courtroom. Zafar was brought into the hall as a prisoner, forced to recline on a modest charpoy as a panel of British military officers sat in judgment over him. The trial lasted for 21 days, and its fundamental legal premise was steeped in paradox. The East India Company, which technically still ruled India under the legal authority originally granted by the Mughal throne, was now trying the Mughal emperor for treason against the company. The chief prosecutor, Major F.J. Harriet, charged Zafar with 4 primary offenses: aiding and abetting the mutiny of the sepoy troops, encouraging the people of India to wage war against the British government, assuming the sovereignty of Hindustan, and bearing responsibility for the murder of European civilians within the palace grounds. The proceedings were conducted entirely in English, a language the 82-year-old emperor did not understand, requiring a constant and often clumsy process of translation into Urdu. The prosecution presented a mountain of documentary evidence, largely consisting of orders, letters, and proclamations that bore the imperial seal, attempting to paint Zafar as the grand, calculating architect of a massive conspiracy to exterminate the British presence in India. The trial was military in nature, characterized by relaxed evidentiary standards and a clear political objective. When Zafar was finally permitted to present his defense, he submitted a written statement that laid bare the agonizing reality of his position during the summer of 1857. He argued, with considerable justification, that he had possessed no prior knowledge of the mutiny and had no role in planning it. When the rebel soldiers stormed his palace, he was entirely defenseless. He told the court that he was effectively a hostage in his own home, coerced and threatened by heavily armed men who used his name and his seal without his consent. He pointed out that his own royal guards were vastly outnumbered, and that any attempt to resist the mutineers would have resulted in his immediate assassination. Zafar's defense was the plea of a helpless old man caught in the machinery of a war he did not start and could not control. The British military judges, however, were entirely unmoved. The trauma and fury of the 1857 uprising had hardened British attitudes into an uncompromising demand for retribution. They needed a central villain to blame for the near collapse of their empire, and the figurehead of the rebellion served that purpose perfectly. On the 9th of March 1858, the military commission returned a unanimous verdict. Bahadur Shah Zafar was found guilty on all charges. In a normal British military trial for treason, such a verdict would carry an automatic sentence of death by hanging. But Zafar was not executed. The decision to spare his life was influenced by multiple political and diplomatic factors. Foremost among them was the assurance of life reportedly given to him by William Hodson during the surrender at Humayun's tomb, a promise that the higher British command felt obligated to honor. Furthermore, British administrators were acutely aware of the danger of creating a powerful religious and political martyr. Executing the last Mughal emperor on Indian soil might ignite another wave of uncontrollable violence. Instead, they chose a punishment designed to strip him of his majesty, isolate him from his people, and erase him from the physical landscape of the subcontinent. They sentenced the Emperor of India to permanent exile. The trial of Bahadur Shah Zafar coincided with the ultimate political transformation of the subcontinent. The uprising of 1857 had fundamentally shattered the British government's confidence in the East India Company's ability to govern India. The chaotic administration, the deep cultural insensitivity, and the devastating military failures that led to the mutiny convinced the Parliament in London that the era of corporate rule had to end. In August 1856, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act, a monumental piece of legislation that formally dissolved the East India Company's ruling powers and transferred control of all its Indian territories directly to the British Crown. Queen Victoria was declared the sovereign of India, initiating the era of the British Raj. This legislative act formally extinguished the Mughal dynasty as a political institution. The dual system of power, where a British corporation ruled in the name of an Indian emperor, was replaced by direct imperial domination. With his empire officially erased from the map, the time came for Zafar's physical removal from his homeland. In October 1858, in the quiet early hours of the morning to avoid drawing a sympathetic crowd, the elderly frail emperor was loaded into a bullock cart. He was accompanied by his wife Zinat Mahal, his young son Jawan Bakht, and a tiny handful of remaining attendants. The journey into exile was an agonizing ordeal of physical discomfort and profound emotional sorrow. The small procession traveled overland through the dusty plains of northern India, a landscape that had been ruled by his ancestors for more than 3 centuries. They eventually reached the port city of Calcutta, the capital of British power in India, where they were placed aboard a naval ship, the HMS Megara. As the ship sailed out into the Bay of Bengal, Bahadur Shah Zafar watched the shores of India disappear beneath the horizon, knowing with absolute certainty that he would never see his homeland, his beloved Delhi, or the grand tombs of his ancestors again. On the 4th of December, 1858, the ship arrived in Rangoon, the capital of British-controlled Lower Burma. Zafar was now thousands of miles away from the cultural world he had known. The British authorities in Rangoon were determined to ensure that the deposed emperor lived out his final days in absolute obscurity. He was not thrown into a medieval dungeon, nor was he subjected to physical torture, but his life was reduced to the tightly controlled, suffocating reality of a high-security political prisoner. The royal family was placed in a small, wooden house located within the compound of the British Guard detail, heavily surrounded by an imposing palisade fence. The entire household was placed under the strict supervision of Captain Nelson Davies, a British officer tasked with ensuring that Zafar had no contact with the outside world. The family was granted a meager financial allowance, barely enough to maintain a dignified household, and they were forbidden from receiving unauthorized visitors. The most devastating aspect of Zafar's exile in Rangoon was the complete loss of his cultural identity. He was an emperor without a court, a patron without artists, and a poet without an audience. The humid, tropical climate of Burma was entirely alien to a man who had spent 8 decades in the dry, seasonal landscapes of northern India. The language, the architecture, and the rhythms of daily life in Rangoon were completely foreign to him. Under the strict surveillance of his British guards, he was officially denied access to pen and paper, a devastating punishment for a man whose entire inner life was devoted to poetry and calligraphy. A widespread later tradition, deeply embedded in the cultural memory of the subcontinent, holds that in his despair, Zafar resorted to writing his final mournful verses using a piece of burnt charcoal on the bare walls of his wooden prison. While historians treat the literal truth of the charcoal story with caution, as it is difficult to verify through contemporary administrative archives, the emotional truth it conveys is undeniable. The poetry attributed to his final years is permeated with a crushing sense of loss, isolation, and the agonizing pain of separation from his homeland. The most famous couplet associated with his exile perfectly captures the tragedy of his fate. In it, the poet laments his wretched luck, noting that after a lifetime of empire, he could not even secure 2 yards of land for his grave in his beloved homeland. Whether every word was physically written in Rangoon or adapted by later admirers, these verses cemented Zafar's identity as the ultimate symbol of tragic displacement. As the years dragged on in the suffocating confinement of Rangoon, the elderly emperor's health inevitably began to fail. His spirit was broken, his body weakened by age and the trauma of his experiences, and his mind frequently slipped into the comforting shadows of the past. By the autumn of 1862, it was clear that the end was approaching. A severe throat infection, complicated by a sudden physical decline, left him bedridden. On the morning of Friday, the 7th of November 1862, at the age of 87, Abu Zafar Siraj ud-Din Muhammad Bahadur Shah II, the last emperor of the Mughal dynasty, died in British custody. The British colonial administration had long anticipated his death, and they were determined to manage his burial with the same cold, calculating efficiency that had defined his exile. Captain Davies, the officer in charge of the prisoner, submitted an official report confirming the death. British officials were intensely fearful that the grave of the last Mughal emperor could one day become a site of political pilgrimage or a religious shrine, serving as a permanent, physical reminder of the dynasty they had worked so hard to destroy. Consequently, they made deliberate bureaucratic decisions to ensure that his burial was as inconspicuous as possible. There was no grand funeral procession, no imperial mourning, and no architectural monument to mark the passing of a sovereign whose ancestors had built the Taj Mahal. Instead, on the very day he died, a grave was quietly dug at the back of the British Guard enclosure. Zafar was buried, wrapped in a simple cloth, his funeral attended only by his immediate family and a few British officers. The earth was quickly packed down, and grass was laid over the site to conceal the exact location of the burial. Captain Davies coldly noted in his official correspondence that the grave had been leveled, ensuring that no physical trace remained to attract future attention. The British strategy of erasure was, for a time, highly successful. As the decades passed, the wooden house where Zafar lived was eventually demolished to make way for new military buildings, and the precise location of the grave faded from local memory. Zeenat Mahal and the surviving family members remained in Burma, stripped of their imperial titles and absorbed into the ordinary population, while the vast palaces they had once inhabited in Delhi were repurposed as British military barracks or simply torn down. By the turn of the 20th century, the exact resting place of the last Mughal emperor was lost beneath the soil of a changing city. But while the physical grave was lost, the memory of the man was undergoing a profound transformation across the Indian subcontinent. As the Indian nationalist movement began to gain momentum in the early 20th century, historical perspectives on the events of 1857 fundamentally shifted. What the British colonial establishment had strictly termed the Sepoy Mutiny, framing it as an illegal, illegitimate rebellion by disloyal soldiers, was increasingly re-evaluated by Indian writers and political leaders as the First War of Independence. In this emerging national narrative, Bahadur Shah Zafar was no longer viewed through the British lens as a traitor or a helpless figurehead. Instead, he was elevated to the status of a foundational patriot, a symbol of unity who had stood at the center of a grand struggle against colonial tyranny. His poetry, once the tragic lament of a defeated man, became anthems of resistance and cultural survival, recited in homes and political gatherings across India. Recognizing this enduring cultural power, early 20th century visitors to Rangoon began to seek out the site of his exile. In response to mounting public pressure, local authorities eventually placed a small stone tablet near the general area where he was believed to have been buried, though colonial terminology still minimized his status, referring to him merely as the former king of Delhi. Yet, the actual physical remains of the emperor remained undiscovered. The final, unexpected chapter in the physical journey of Bahadur Shah Zafar occurred more than a century after his death. In 1991, the city of Rangoon, now known as Yangon in the independent nation of Myanmar, was undergoing rapid urban development. During routine construction work to lay a drainage pipe near the site of the old British cantonment, laborers struck a solid, subterranean structure. Excavations revealed a carefully constructed, brick-lined grave hidden deep beneath the earth. Based on historical administrative records, British architectural maps from the 1860s, and the precise location within the former compound of Captain Davies, authorities identified the site as the lost grave of Bahadur Shah Zafar. While modern definitive DNA testing was not the basis of the identification, the overwhelming circumstantial and historical evidence satisfied both local and international observers. The discovery sent ripples of profound emotion across South Asia. The deliberate colonial attempt to erase the final resting place of the emperor had ultimately failed. Following the discovery, a concerted effort was made to properly honor the fallen monarch. The site in Yangon was transformed from a forgotten patch of earth into a beautifully maintained mausoleum. Today, the location functions not merely as a historical monument, but as a revered dargah, a Sufi shrine. Visitors from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and beyond travel to Yangon to pay their respects to the poet king. They cover his grave with rose petals, light incense, and recite the verses he wrote, treating him with the reverence reserved for spiritual saints and beloved historical martyrs. The tragedy of Bahadur Shah Zafar is one of the most compelling narratives of the 19th century because it perfectly encapsulates the violent collision between an ancient, culturally rich world and the relentless machinery of modern empire. Zafar did not restore the Mughal Empire, nor did he possess the ruthless military command required to win the uprising of 1857. His historical importance does not stem from his power, but from his profound powerlessness in the face of destiny and the immense symbolic weight he carried on his fragile shoulders. He represented the final, fading heartbeat of a dynasty that had shaped the art, architecture, cuisine, and culture of the subcontinent for 300 years. His trial and exile marked the definitive end of the medieval world in India and the terrifying consolidation of British colonial power. Yet, in the grand sweep of history, the meticulous calculations of his British captors ultimately fell short. They took away his throne, they stripped him of his palace, they destroyed his city, and they even sought to erase the certainty of his grave. But they could not destroy the immense cultural and emotional meaning attached to his name. The East India Company has long since vanished into the archives of history, and the vast British Raj that replaced it eventually fractured and fell. But the poetry of Bahadur Shah Zafar is still read, his tragedy is still mourned, and his shrine remains a place of quiet, enduring dignity. The Mughal Empire ended with Bahadur Shah Zafar, yet the memory of its last emperor outlived the empire that defeated him.